Good evening. Tonight we bring you a story that connects geopolitical warnings from one of America's most respected military strategists to a threat facing every American who owns precious metals, a threat rooted not in foreign adversaries, but in historical precedent and executive power that remains on the books to this day. Colonel Douglas Macgregor, former senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense and a decorated combat veteran, has issued increasingly urgent warnings about the potential for major conflict. But tonight we're examining what Macgregor's warnings mean beyond the battlefield, specifically what they mean for your financial security and your constitutional property rights. What I'm about to share with you isn't speculation, it's history, and history, as we know, has a disturbing tendency to repeat itself. Let's begin. Colonel Macgregor has been warning for months about escalating tensions with Russia, potential conflict in Eastern Europe, and what he describes as a march toward major war driven by foreign policy decisions that lack strategic wisdom. His military credentials are impeccable: a PhD in international relations, decades of service, and a reputation for speaking uncomfortable truths regardless of political convenience. But here's what most analysts are missing when they discuss Macgregor's warnings: the domestic implications. Specifically, what happens to civilian assets when a nation goes to war, or even when a national emergency is declared. Most Americans, when they think about war, imagine military mobilization, drafts, troop deployments, defense production. What they don't consider is financial mobilization, the government's seizure of private assets deemed necessary for the war effort. This isn't theoretical, it's historical fact, and the legal framework for it remains in place today. On April 5, 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. This order made it illegal for American citizens to own gold coins, gold bullion, or gold certificates. Citizens were given until May 1st, less than a month, to turn in their gold to the Federal Reserve in exchange for $20.67 per ounce. The penalty for noncompliance? Up to 10 years in federal prison and a $10,000 fine, equivalent to over $200,000 in today's dollars. Let me be clear about what happened. The United States government, through executive order, not congressional legislation but executive order, criminalized the private ownership of monetary gold. Americans who had accumulated gold as savings, as insurance against the failing banking system, as a store of value, were forced to surrender it to the government under threat of imprisonment. Then, once the government had collected the gold, they revalued it. The Gold Reserve Act of 1934 raised the official price of gold to $35 per ounce, a 69% increase overnight. In other words, the government forced citizens to sell at $20.67, then immediately declared the gold was actually worth $35. The government effectively confiscated nearly 70% of the value of every gold ounce from American citizens. This wasn't done under wartime emergency powers. This was done during the Great Depression, justified as necessary to combat economic crisis and restore the banking system. The precedent was set. In times of national crisis, the government claims the authority to seize precious metals from private citizens. Now, let's fast forward to today. Executive Order 6102 was partially repealed in 1974 when Americans were again allowed to own gold. But the legal framework, the underlying authority claimed by the executive branch to confiscate private property during emergencies, was never fully dismantled. The Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, still in effect today, grants the president extraordinary powers during declared emergencies. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977 updated and expanded those authorities. The National Emergencies Act of 1976 codified the process for declaring emergencies. Combined, these statutes give the executive branch sweeping powers to regulate financial transactions, freeze assets, and confiscate property deemed necessary for national security during declared emergencies. And here's what should concern every precious metals owner. We are currently operating under dozens of declared national emergencies. These emergencies, once declared, remain in effect until explicitly terminated. Some have been active for decades. The legal infrastructure for asset confiscation isn't something that would need to be created in a crisis. It already exists. It's waiting, dormant, ready to be activated with presidential signature. This brings us back to Colonel Macgregor's warnings and the question we need to ask. If major conflict occurs, or if a national security emergency is declared, what assets would the government target? Let's think strategically. What would a government at war need? Funding. Wars are extraordinarily expensive. The United States spent over $2 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan. A major conflict with a near-peer adversary would dwarf those costs. But there's a problem. The United States is already carrying $35 trillion in federal debt. The government cannot borrow unlimited amounts without triggering currency collapse or sovereign debt crisis. Traditional funding mechanisms have limits. So historically, what have governments done when they need massive funding and can't borrow it? They confiscate assets from their own citizens. Now in 1933, the target was gold because gold was money. The dollar was still theoretically backed by gold, and controlling the gold supply meant controlling the monetary system. Today, in 2025, what would be the target? Gold remains an obvious choice. But there's an even more strategic target, silver. Let me explain why silver presents a more compelling target for government confiscation than gold. First, industrial necessity. Silver is not just a monetary metal, it's a critical strategic material. Modern defense systems, advanced weapons, communications equipment, radar, missiles, drones, and electronic warfare systems all require silver. In a major war, demand for silver from the defense industrial base would spike dramatically. Unlike gold, which is primarily monetary and ornamental, silver is functionally irreplaceable in many military applications due to its unique electrical and thermal properties. Second, affordability and accessibility. Gold at $2,600 per ounce is expensive enough that most middle-class Americans own little or none. Silver at $30 per ounce is accessible to average citizens. There are millions of Americans holding silver coins, bars, and bullion, a large distributed supply that represents a significant national resource. From a government perspective, confiscating gold affects primarily the wealthy. Confiscating silver affects a broader base of citizens, but yields a larger absolute quantity of metal essential for industrial war production. Third, legal precedent. The 1933 confiscation targeted gold, but the legal language was about hoarding precious metals during national emergency. That precedent applies equally to silver, platinum, or any other metal deemed essential for national security. Fourth, and this is critical, public perception. Confiscating gold carries historical weight and would generate significant opposition because of 1933. Silver confiscation would be framed not as seizure of money, but as collection of strategic materials for defense, much easier to sell politically. The narrative would be simple. Unpatriotic hoarders are depriving our troops of critical materials needed to defend the nation. That's a powerful message during wartime. Now, some of you might be thinking this sounds far-fetched. Let me show you why it's not. Look at what's happening right now in precious metals markets before any declared emergency, before any conflict. COMEX silver inventories, the silver stored in registered vaults available for delivery, have been declining. We've seen significant drawdowns over the past 3 years. Metal is leaving the United States. London Bullion Market Association vaults show similar patterns. Physical metal is being moved, relocated, shifted from public exchanges to private storage, from Western vaults to Eastern vaults, from accessible locations to secure, offshore locations. Why would sophisticated institutions, banks, sovereign wealth funds, ultra-high net worth families be moving physical metal out of easily accessible locations? Because they understand something most retail investors don't. Accessible silver is vulnerable silver. If you're a billionaire family office or a sovereign wealth fund, and you hear geopolitical warnings from people like Colonel McGregor, and you understand the history of Executive Order 6102, what do? You move your metal. You put it in offshore storage. You use allocated vaults in jurisdictions with strong property rights. You get it out of the United States where it could be seized under emergency powers. The smart money isn't waiting to see if confiscation happens. They're positioning now while movement is still legal and unrestricted. This creates a dangerous irony. As the wealthy and connected move their metals to safety, the remaining metal, held primarily by middle-class Americans in domestic storage, becomes an even more attractive target for government confiscation because it's the only supply left. Let me walk you through how this would actually unfold if it happens. Step 1. A major conflict breaks out or a severe national emergency is declared. This could be war with Russia or China, a major terrorist attack, a grid-down scenario, or a financial crisis deemed threatening to national security. Step 2. The president invokes emergency powers under existing statutes. No new legislation required. The legal framework already exists. Step 3. An executive order is issued declaring that private hoarding of silver and potentially other precious metals constitutes a threat to national security by depriving the defense industrial base of critical materials. Step 4. Citizens are given a deadline, probably 30 to 90 days, to surrender silver to designated government collection points. Compensation would be at fair value, as determined by the government, likely below market rates, and paid in increasingly devalued dollars. Step 5. Criminal penalties are established for non-compliance. Possession of hoarded silver after the deadline becomes a federal crime, punishable by fines and imprisonment. Step 6. Financial institutions are required to report customers with safe deposit boxes or storage arrangements containing precious metals. Privacy vanishes. Step 7. The government pays for the confiscated silver with newly created currency, effectively acquiring the metal for free in real terms, while citizens receive depreciating paper. This isn't fiction. This is precisely how Executive Order 6102 functioned in 1933. The mechanism is established. The precedent exists. The legal authority remains. The question isn't whether the government has the power to do this. They demonstrated in 1933 that they do, and subsequent legislation has maintained those authorities. The question is whether circumstances will arise where they choose to exercise that power. And that's where Colonel Macgregor's warnings become directly relevant to your financial security. Macgregor isn't predicting war because he wants war. He's warning about war because he sees Western policy creating conditions where major conflict becomes increasingly probable. He sees escalation in Ukraine, provocations regarding Taiwan, Middle East instability, and a foreign policy establishment that seems to be sleepwalking into confrontation. If Macgregor is right, if major conflict is coming, then financial martial law isn't a paranoid fantasy. It's a logical next step. Wars require resources. The government will take those resources from wherever they're available, and precious metals, particularly silver, represent a large, quantifiable, confiscatable resource held by private citizens. Now let's address the obvious question. What can you do? First, understand that widespread knowledge of this risk actually reduces the likelihood of confiscation. If millions of Americans understand the historical precedent and are watching for signs, it becomes politically more difficult to execute. Knowledge is defensive. Second, consider allocation strategies. Don't keep all your metals in one location or one form. Diversify storage methods and jurisdictions if possible. Third, understand the difference between reportable and non-reportable transactions. While I'm not providing legal advice, there are differences in how various forms of precious metals are treated under current regulations. Fourth, consider the timing. Moving metals during an emergency or after restrictions are announced is too late. If this is a concern, positioning happens now, during peacetime, when movement is unrestricted. Fifth, balance physical security with seizure risk. A safe in your home protects against theft, but not against federal agents with a warrant. Offshore allocated storage protects against domestic confiscation, but requires trust in foreign jurisdictions and institutions. There's no perfect solution. Every strategy has trade-offs. The key is informed decision-making based on understanding the actual risks, rather than assuming they don't exist because they seem unlikely. Sixth, own metals in forms that have numismatic or collectible value, not just bullion value. In 1933, rare coins and collectibles were explicitly exempted from confiscation. There's no guarantee that exemption would be repeated, but it's historical precedent worth noting. Seventh, don't dismiss this risk just because it sounds extreme. It happened before in living memory. People who experienced 1933 are gone, but it was less than 100 years ago. Historical precedent is the best predictor of government behavior during crisis. Now, let me address the counter-argument. Many analysts will tell you confiscation is impossible today because the political and economic contexts are completely different from 1933. They'll say Americans wouldn't comply. They'll say enforcement would be impossible. They'll say the backlash would be too severe. These arguments ignore several realities. First, compliance in 1933 was actually quite high. Most Americans facing the threat of federal prison surrendered their gold. Some hid it, certainly, but the majority complied. Americans generally follow the law even when they disagree with it. Second, enforcement today would be far more effective than in 1933 due to digital financial surveillance. The government can track large precious metals purchases through dealer reporting requirements. They can monitor safe deposit box access. They can require banks and dealers to provide customer lists. The surveillance infrastructure is vastly more sophisticated than 90 years ago. Third, during genuine national emergency, particularly war, political opposition to government actions decreases dramatically. The Patriot Act passed with overwhelming support after September 11th. Emergency powers that would be unthinkable during peacetime become acceptable when the population is frightened. Fourth, the narrative matters. If confiscation is framed as patriotic contribution to the war effort rather than government seizure, public opposition softens. Support our troops by surrendering strategic materials is politically viable messaging during conflict. Fifth, the government doesn't need 100% compliance. Even 60% to 70% compliance yields enormous quantities of metal. Perfect enforcement isn't necessary for the policy to achieve its objectives. So when people dismiss this scenario as implausible, they're often assuming peacetime conditions, political norms, and constitutional constraints that disappear during declared emergencies. What Colonel Macgregor is warning about is the breakdown of peacetime norms, and when those norms break down, everything changes. Let me show you one more piece of evidence that this isn't paranoid speculation. In 2021, the World Gold Council published a report discussing central bank policies regarding private gold ownership. Buried in the technical language was an acknowledgement that many nations maintain the legal authority to restrict or prohibit private ownership of monetary metals during emergencies. The International Monetary Fund has published papers discussing the mobilization of private metal stocks during financial crises as a policy tool for member nations. These aren't conspiracy websites. These are official institutions discussing, in academic language, the confiscation of privately held metals as a standard policy option. The infrastructure, legal, institutional, and conceptual, for precious metals confiscation exists at the international level, not just domestically. Let's bring this full circle. Colonel McGregor sees war coming. Whether he's right or wrong, his warnings are based on decades of military and strategic experience. He's not an alarmist by nature. He's a sober analyst who has concluded that current trajectories lead to conflict. If war comes, or if national emergency is declared, the government will need resources, massive resources they cannot acquire through normal taxation or borrowing without triggering economic collapse. History shows precisely what governments do in that situation. They confiscate private assets deemed necessary for national purposes. Silver, as both a monetary metal and a critical strategic material, is the perfect target. It's widely held by private citizens, essential for defense production, and confiscatable under existing legal authorities. The draining of COMEX and LBMA vaults, the movement of metal offshore, the repositioning by sophisticated investors, these are early warning signs that the smart money sees what's coming. They're not preparing for silver price appreciation. They're preparing for silver confiscation. They're moving their metal beyond the reach of emergency executive orders before those orders are issued. The average American holding silver coins in a safe deposit box or a home safe isn't thinking this way. They're thinking about inflation protection, purchasing power preservation, maybe barter capability during crisis. They're not thinking about federal agents with warrants executing an executive order that makes their metal holdings illegal. But that's exactly what happened in 1933, and the people it happened to weren't expecting it either. So what's the bottom line tonight? Colonel McGregor's warnings about war aren't just about geopolitics. They're about domestic policy consequences. War means emergency powers. Emergency powers mean asset confiscation. Asset confiscation means your precious metals become government property. This isn't prediction. It's historical pattern recognition. It's understanding that governments under stress behave predictably, and that behavior includes seizure of private wealth. Whether this actually happens depends on factors none of us can control: geopolitical decisions, escalation dynamics, the outbreak or avoidance of major conflict. What you can control is your awareness of the risk, your understanding of historical precedent, and your decisions about how to position your assets given that knowledge. The elites are positioning now. They're moving metal. They're using offshore storage. They're taking this seriously. The question is, are you? Because if McGregor is right about the coming trouble, the government isn't just preparing the military. They're preparing to fill the Treasury's vaults, and they're planning to fill them with your silver. That's our report tonight. Thank you for watching.